In this video, Magnus Carlsen's attacking chess leaves Alireza Firouzja speechless at the 2024 Julian Baer Generation Cup. Now in the game, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and Alireza Firouzja 1c5, the Sicilian Defense on the board. Now here, Magnus knight f3, e6, and instead of 3d4 heading for an open Sicilian, here Magnus goes 3d3, heading for some sort of King's Indian attack or closed Sicilian. Now Alireza knight c6, g3, and then d5 on the board. Alireza breaking in the center in the spirit of this e6 Sicilian defense. Now here, instead of allowing d takes e4 and the trade of queens, here Magnus goes queen to e2. Keeping queens on the board is in a very aggressive mood in this game. So how is Alireza going to combat Magnus Carlsen's King's Indian attack setup? He goes knight g to e7, and then after bishop g2, he goes g6, a very provocative move. Typically, you don't want to go g6 in this sort of position because here, Magnus Carlsen has the option of going h4, expanding on the king side, and that is exactly what he does. h4 on the board. Magnus, again, is in a very aggressive mood in this game. Now here, if Alireza is not careful, Magnus is going to play h5 on the very next move. So here, h6 for Alireza. The idea being if Magnus goes h5, then he can go g5, keeping the king side blocked. So Magnus does not go h5 yet. Instead, e5 on the board, closing the center, and now he's going to have free reign to attack on the king side. Meanwhile, Alireza is going to have to get an attack going on the queen side with moves like b5, a5, b4, and so on. Now here, bishop g7, c3, and b5 for Alireza, expanding on the queen side. Now bishop f4 for Magnus, bolstering that pawn on the e5 square, and then a5 for Alireza. Again, b4 is going to be the idea in the very near future. Now here, Magnus knight b d2, developing the queen side, and then b4 on the board. The idea being perhaps b takes c3, then rook b8, and then try to infiltrate on the b file with the rook. All right, Magnus a3, very combative idea. Now b takes, and then here Alireza plays the move a4, locking down the queen side. The idea being now a4 is impossible from Magnus, and here Alireza can go rook to b8, and then rook b3, pressuring those pawns on c3 and a3. Now here, Magnus rook b1, challenging the open b file. And Alireza bishop to a6, a very active move with the bishop. And of course, because Alireza has these pawns on the light squares, this bishop is never going to be active on this diagonal. So bishop a6, a very good move, activating the bishop on this diagonal and putting the x-ray pressure on the queen and maybe even the rook on the f1 square if white castles on the king side. Now here, Magnus does castle, castles on the board, and again, the bishop very, very active on this diagonal. Now here, Alireza goes knight to f5, a very provocative move. Now rook f to c1 for Magnus, the idea being he wants to go knight f1, then knight to e3, developing the knight onto a better square and keeping the rooks active on b1 and c1. Now Alireza rook b8, challenging Magnus Carlsen's rook on the b1 square, and here knight to f1 on the board, Magnus Carlsen continuing his plan. However, there were some better ideas. For example, rook takes b8 immediately may have been a stronger move by Magnus, the idea being rook takes, queen takes, and then c4, try to lock out Black's light squared bishop on the queen side. Instead, knight to f1 on the board for Magnus. He's just continuing that plan of rook f to c1 and then knight to f1. And here, rook to b3 from Alireza Firouzja. Very active move, pressuring that pawn on the a3 square of Magnus. Now here, knight to e3, threatening knight takes f5, but also giving up that pawn on a3 in the process. But can Alireza Firouzja take the pawn? Turns out he can, but it's not a very good idea. Here, Alireza does go ahead and take that pawn on the a3 square. Rook takes a3 on the board. However, the problem with this move is here Magnus can jump in and take the knight on f5 and damage Black's pawn structure no matter how he recaptures. And that is what happens. Knight takes and then g takes on the board. You definitely don't want to go e takes. That would just shatter the pawns on the queen side. So instead, g takes f5 on the board by Alireza Firouzja, but now his king side pawns are weakened. And look at this, if he ever castles on the king side, his king is going to be incredibly vulnerable there. So Magnus here, rook to a1, challenging Alireza Firouzja's rook on the a3 square. Now rook takes a1, and suddenly Magnus is the one attacking on the queen side. All right, Alireza c4 on the board, try to lock down the queen side, but Magnus does not go d4. That would be a mistake. Instead, he goes queen to c2, maintaining the tension on the queen side. That is something Magnus loves to do in almost any position, just maintaining the tension and giving his opponent more chances to make errors. And here, that is exactly what happens. The best move in this position for Alireza Firouzja, and it's not a very complicated move, it's going to be bishop b5, just defending the pawn on the a4 square with the bishop. Instead, queen b6 on the board. Alireza trying to make a more active move here. However, this is immediately a mistake, and Magnus can capture on a4 with the rook or the queen. In the game, he captures with the queen, the more active idea. Now he has the attack on the knight on c6 and pressure on the bishop on the a6 square. So Alireza has to respond. Bishop b5, getting the bishop out of the attack and relieving the pressure on this diagonal. Of course, the knight was being pinned by the queen to the king. Now, queen to a3 for Magnus, pressuring this diagonal here and stopping short castles as the queen does control the f8 square. So Alireza cannot allow that. Bishop to f8, the bishop doing very little on this diagonal here. So bishop f8, a very good move, trying to reroute the bishop to a better square. Perhaps Alireza wants to go bishop c5 with pressure on that f2 point, and from there he will be able to castle kingside. Now here Magnus, of course, he gets the queen out of the attack of the bishop. He goes queen to a8 check, hitting the king and forcing a king move. Here, king d7 on the board, and now the king is trapped in the middle of the board. Now here, Magnus, d takes c4, bishop takes, and then knight to d2, pressuring the bishop on the c4 square, and Magnus trying to reactivate more of his pieces to get an attack going against Alireza Firouzja's king on d7. Now here, bishop d3 getting out of the attack, and the bishop potentially eyeing the e4 square where it is supported by those two pawns on f5 and d5. But now Magnus, he increases the pressure, he gets his attack going. c4 on the board. Magnus Carlsen trying to open up more lines of attack against Alireza Firouzja's king. For example, if d takes c4, then rook d1, getting the rook on the newly opened d-file could be incredibly dangerous. Now here, Alireza bishop g7, putting more pressure on that pawn on e5, and now queen to a4 for Magnus, pinning the knight on c6 with the queen. Now queen d4, activating the queen, and then rook d1 by Magnus, setting up the x-ray attack of the rook on the queen and the king on the d7 square. Of course, there were other ideas, and real fast, I do want to show a very important tactical motive, is this move is going to come up again and again in this game. Here, the right idea would have been bishop to e3, giving up the pawn on e5, but after queen takes, you can go rook to c1, putting so much pressure on that knight on the c6 square, and it turns out that is going to be the key tactical idea for Magnus in this middle game. All right, instead, rook d1 on the board, again, pressuring the queen and the king on d4 and d7, and here Alireza, bishop b2, hitting the rook b1, gets the rook out of the attack, and then rook to c8 defends the knight on c6. Very good move. The rook, of course, doing very, very little on h8, so Alireza has to activate his last piece into the game. Now here, Magnus, queen to a3, very strong move, eyeing that very important d6 square with the queen. The threat now is simply queen d6 check, and then perhaps infiltrating with the rook. That would be incredibly dangerous. So here, Alireza Firouzja, bishop to f8, challenges the queen. Now queen to a6, and then bishop c5. And here, Alireza, he has so much pressure on that pawn on f2. Magnus has to find the right response. Now here, again, the right move for Magnus is going to be bishop e3, challenging the queen and the bishop on this diagonal. However, Magnus, again, he doesn't find that move. Instead here, he takes the pawn on d5, and this might be the single worst blunder I have ever seen in my life by Magnus Carlsen, and I am not exaggerating. First of all, this move gives up the pawn on f2 with check. Alireza takes it, queen takes f2, the king has to move, king to h2. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen's queen is hanging. Let's go back real fast to this position right here. Here, Magnus takes on d5, opening up the line of attack of the bishop on the queen. He literally blundered his queen. Alireza takes on f2, the king moves, and here Alireza, he plays e takes d5. Either I'm missing something, or there's an error in the broadcast, or Magnus Carlsen literally hung his queen and Alireza missed it, and now Magnus, he turns up the pressure. You don't have to give this guy two chances in this game. Queen b7, hitting the king, king d8, then queen takes f7. Magnus, he wants to go rook to f7, and then threaten checkmate on the 7th rank. All right, bishop e7 defends, but then queen takes d5, wins yet another pawn. The king has to move, king to e8, then queen to g8 check, bishop f8, now queen f6 hits the king again, king d8, queen f6 check, king e8, and here rook to b7, threatening ideas like queen to f7, king d8, then queen d7 checkmate. What is Alireza going to do? He goes knight to e7, blocking the communication of the rook and the queen along the 7th rank. But here, Magnus Carlsen, the finishing blow, e6, And here the threats are just overwhelming. For example, queen f7, king d8, then queen takes f8 is being threatened in this position. And here, Alireza Firouzja resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. He knows when he is beat, and he is done in this game. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen. What a display of attacking chess. And before you go, check out this video right here of Magnus Carlsen shocking Alireza Firouzja with the King's Gambit opening. I think you're going to love it. It was a brilliant attacking game. And I will see you in the next video.